All right. So we'll get started here very shortly as we'll let people kind of pile in here. Hi, Taylor.
Hey,
How are you?
good. How are you?
Good. We're live right now, so don't say anything mean about the people.
Okay, I won't.
Okay, good. We'll give people a couple more minutes to pile in here and wait for Kevin as well.
Okay.
What's up, Geronimo?
Oh yeah, those Canadians. Just kidding, Jordan.
You're right there close to the border, Taylor.
I know.
It's like
It's only
border
like an hour and
wars.
a half, I think.
Mm,
I'm basically Canadian.
there you go. Kevin's coming on.
What's up, everybody? How are you?
What's up, man?
Let me turn my camera on real quick.
We got Vicente from Ecuador. That's pretty freaking cool.
That is cool.
Glad you could make it, Steven. Okay. Kevin, are you going cameraless for this one?
No, I'm turning it on right here.
Oh,
Just
okay.
give me one
Didn't know
second.
all right. Didn't know if you had done your hair or...
I did get a haircut though.
Did you? Nice. There
Yeah.
you go.
So for a
Quarantine buzz?
while, what's that?
Quarantine buzz?
I have a funny story about that actually. So in the midst of quarantine, I actually had my hair cut by a coworker in the staff bathroom. So
Wow.
desperate times call for desperate measures.
That's
But
amazing.
I
Seriously.
came out with both ears, so it was an upgrade from what I had.
This is what this one from your staff member?
Yeah, she did a
Oh,
good
that's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's not bad at all.
That is
Uh,
pretty good.
yeah, I just let mine go, but then our barbershop actually opened back up. So I was like, yeah, I'll do that.
Hey, Diego.
Yeah,
Thanks for
cool.
joining
Okay.
us.
We'll go ahead and get started. So I think people are raring to go on this one. I'm excited about it. So I'll start with our usual logistics. If you're new to the Clinical Athlete Community or this is your first journal club, welcome. As far as participation, here are your options. You can raise, if you want to say something verbally, you can raise your digital hand. There should be a little icon there for you. And then we can go through the list, or actually, I think it's me that can only see that. I still haven't fixed that. But I'll see your digital hand, and then I can unmute you, and you can actually talk into the meeting. It's like a live radio show. So you can say your piece, and then you can take your point or question and further the discussion. So that's one way you can participate. Another way is if you don't want to be unmuted and actually talk, but you still want your question posed and talked about, you can put it in the Q&A box. And note that you've got two options to kind of chat along with people. You've got a chat box and you've got a Q&A. If you want us to use your question and to talk about it and to see it for sure, use the Q&A box specifically. If you just want to kind of have a running chat going and have like side conversations, if you've ever been to like a live YouTube or live Facebook event or something, you've seen the chat just kind of rolling, you can use the chat for that. And there's been some great discussion, kind of side discussion as we go through the meetings in the chat over the past several weeks. So use that, feel free, it's live. Or you can just be an active listener. You can sit back and kind of soak in the discussion. So all of those things are your options, and you're free to choose whatever you'd like. We do record these and we put them in the Clinical Athlete Forum along with all the other great resources there pertaining to athlete health and performance. So if you're interested in the Clinical Athlete Forum, I just copy and pasted the application link into the chat box. I'm also going to paste the paper that we're going to discuss, a link to the PDF. So if you hadn't downloaded it, you can click that link that I just popped into the chat and you can download the paper that that we're going to talk about. And then a quick note on sound. If you were unmuted and you were joining the conversation, but let's say time goes by and you're no longer talking, try to remember to mute yourself again, because any background noise that you don't kind of realize can come through and it can be a little bit distracting. So just be cognizant of that. And we still need a meeting scribe. We've had people volunteer to be the meeting scribe for our past several meetings, which is awesome. So the meeting scribe is a person responsible for summarizing key points. So if you already kind of take notes during the discussion, like little bullet points and just key talking points that we went over, send those over to us and we can put those in the forum underneath the video recording so that people can follow along who couldn't be there. So if we have a volunteer for a meeting scribe, just email us your notes. Doesn't have to be anything crazy. info@clinicalathlete.com, and I just pop that in the chat as well. So we're super appreciative for anybody who wants to volunteer for that. With all of that, sorry.
Azita said that she would do it.
Awesome. Thank you. That's very, very helpful. With all of that said, welcome to the Clinical Athlete Journal Club number 22. Is that right? Dang. We're like over legal drinking age now. We made it. My name is Quinn Hennick. I'm a proud clinical athlete provider. I am joined by our clinical athlete intern, Taylor Allen Flanick, who's going to help to foster the discussion. She's going to help us keep track of all the questions and has been really, really, really helpful. So Taylor, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
And we've got Kevin McNamara, who is a physical therapist, and he is completing a sports residency at Johns Hopkins currently. And he's the one who's responsible for bringing the Journal Club to life. So thanks for being here as always, Kevin.
Of course, man. These are great.
And so if anybody's curious about the impetus for why we started this thing, if this is your first Journal Club, way back in the day, a smart guy named Benjamin Franklin started a weekly club. It was called the Junto Club. It was a mutual improvement club, but it was basically just a room of really smart people discussing topics and issues of the day, kind of like what we're doing here. But they had an important policy, and that policy was that all discussions would be conducted in sincere spirit of inquiry, after truth, without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. So we've adopted that as the Journal Club motto. So these meetings are conducted in the sincere spirit of inquiry, after truth, without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. That doesn't mean we can't disagree and have good discussion. It just means you're not coming in here trying to win anything, because we're all kind of on the same journey. We're all just trying to get less wrong. So just keep that in mind as we're moving through. But tonight's Journal Club topic is fatigue. And this topic is huge, and it's very, there's some deep, dark rabbit holes that you can go into when we talk about fatigue in many different ways. I really liked this paper. I enjoyed reading it. I thought it was an entertaining read. And the name of the paper that we're going to discuss is titled "Fatigue is a Brain-Derived Emotion that Regulates the Exercise Behavior to Ensure the Protection of Whole Body Homeostasis." And the solo author is Timothy Noakes. And again, if you weren't able to download the paper earlier, you can download it now in that link that I sent over in the chat, so you can pull it up in front of you. But this is not an experimental paper. It's not a randomized controlled trial. It's a review article, but it's not a systematic review or anything like that. It's basically a peer-reviewed blog post. So it reads like a blog post. It's somebody's kind of opinion on the current topic, but it so happens that this author, Tim Noakes, is a prominent writer, researcher in this area of fatigue. And he is primarily known for his central governor theory, the central governor theory of fatigue. And so it was interesting to read this from his perspective, knowing, kind of all the work that he's done in that regard. So essentially, the paper was kind of discussing the historical background of our notion of fatigue, all the way from A.V. Hill's kind of dualistic model, where it's just body tired, heart tired, no more, do. And that has been kind of the prominent model. So Noakes goes through the history, and essentially the model of fatigue that has been prominent over the last 90 years is, a buildup of lactic acid. The heart's no longer able to support the working muscles, and then we can no longer do the activity. So it's this buildup of work, accumulation of things in the muscles that make us not be able to mechanically do their job, and then the heart can't support it, and then there's just kind of cliff at the end. So a really clean theoretical model, when you think of it that way, it makes sense. Like, you just accumulate all this fatigue linearly, essentially. And when we're talking about fatigue, what activities are we talking about? Primarily, for the sake of this paper, they're discussing endurance-based or aerobic-based activities. So the first half of the paper, the introduction, is mostly this historical background on A.V. Hill's model in the early 1900s, where it's really just heart and body are mostly the feedback mechanism to fatigue. And it's this linear model. The brain is a part of the model in the beginning, but not really talked about, and then kind of taken out of the model, where it's really just the body, and the brain doesn't have a whole lot to do with it. And then Noakes, the author of the paper, kind of talks about the limitations of that. And he gives a lot of different examples of why this would be a problem. So, for example, why would motivation help then? Where you see athletes often, when they're highly motivated or in competition, perform better than training. Why would that be the case if the brain wasn't involved, if there wasn't a psychological element or something like that to the notion of fatigue? And other examples, why would there even be sensation of fatigue if the body, if essentially the brain's taken out of the equation? Why even have a perception of fatigue? Why not just let the heart and the muscles decide when the body stops doing the thing? And that was one of the arguments is fatigue. Later on, he makes an argument that fatigue is a psychological element. It's an emotion of sorts. So if the brain wasn't involved, then that perception would be something different, you would think. And another example of why he questions this linear model of A.V. Hill is, how do we explain when runners have that kick at the end of their race? At the end of a marathon, they're actually able to literally kick it in gear and go faster. Well, if this linear model of fatigue was the most accurate, that wouldn't be possible, because you're approaching this cliff. You wouldn't be able to go then more. You've already given it all you got. If you try to do that, you would stop. So this model doesn't explain that phenomenon. It also doesn't explain the phenomenon of why in these endurance-based activities, we're not usually using all of our motor units and our muscles. So we're often using just a fraction of them, or a certain percentage, 30, 50, 60% of our muscles in any given moment during these tasks. So you would think in A.V. Hill's model, we'd be using all of our muscles, and then they would just poop out. And that's why we can't go anymore. So why are we leaving muscle work on the table at full fatigue, at failure, essentially, and we're still not using all of our muscles? So again, Noakes' argument is there's got to be something psychological here, or something to do with the nervous system. And that's essentially where he came up with the theory of the central governor, was A.V. Hill's original model that did include the brain, which you can see on page 2 of the paper. At the bottom right, you can see the brain is at the top, and it's a governor in the brain or heart causing a slow of the circulation. And so A.V. Hill back in the day called it a governor. And so Noakes kind of took that idea and just made it, no, this is way more important than just kind of a little piece of this overall model. This is the central governor. This is kind of the brain behind the operation. And that's essentially the rest of the paper, is making a case for this. There's a lot of really interesting points that are made that I kind of want to touch on, but basically just to kind of lay out the groundwork. how much of fatigue, of this notion of fatigue, how much is involved, how much of it is subjective and perceptual and not just based on the body's inability to perform mechanical work anymore, but how much of it is affected by our psychological state. And then can that psychological state, I think at the end, he really leaves a lot of cliffhangers and he kind of like pulls us in. But at the end, you know, is this psychological state, what differentiates first place from second place? Is it the decision they make before the race? Is it some type of genetic predisposition to just be able to turn off that emotion and go? Is this a trainable trait? And I think those are the questions that are interesting here. Now, before I shut up and we really get the conversation started, I want to make a note that the central governor theory it doesn't stop there. In fact, there's plenty of detractors and criticisms of the central governor theory. And there's more than one person kind of leading that ship, but if you want one, there's a gentleman named Samuel Marcora, who is also extremely prominent and has done a ton of work. Now, they both agree that the brain is and the central nervous system is heavily involved in the notion of fatigue, but Samuel Marcora has been highly critical of Noakes and the central governor theory, just basically stating it's stayed a theory without evidence to support it, or it's stayed a hypothesis rather, even because there's really no data to support where is the central governor, what part of the brain. And that's one of the biggest criticisms. And I've actually got two papers that I'll link in here from Marcora, one of which is titled, "Do we really need a central governor to explain brain regulation of exercise performance?" I'll put that in the chat for you guys' later research. And then another one that's more recent titled, "The Central Governor Model of Exercise Regulation Teaches Us Precious Little About the Nature of Mental Fatigue and Self-Control Failure." So if you read this Tim Noakes paper and you were like, man, this makes so much sense, central governor, love it, that's the model I'm going to use, hold your horses a little bit. But like I said, both Marcora and Noakes do agree that the brain is heavily involved. And if you're interested in a book, there's a recent book called Endure. And the author is Alex Hutchinson, and he's a science writer, but the book Endure is a really nice read. Essentially, it's like a complete summary of all of the research on fatigue in a very entertaining narrative form. And he interviews Noakes and he interviews Marcora and he puts it all in store. It's really, really good. And it'll give you some context, but Noakes and Marcora actually have had a beef. I don't know where they are with that, but like it was like Twitter wars for sure. Like they were bashing each other and blocking each other, and it got to that point. So just to give you guys some context. Okay, cool. I'll stop there. Kevin, what do you think about this paper?
Yeah, so I mean, I enjoyed this paper. It is a good read, and I think especially kind of first exposure to, you know, other ways or other trains of thought in regards to exercise physiology as potential limiters, I think it definitely makes a lot of kind of intuitive sense, right? But I think it's interesting that you brought up the second paper, because I looked at that paper too, because, you know, I always want to try and get both sides of stuff to get an understanding of what's kind of the reality that we're dealing with. I think in the paper, he actually makes a similar mistake to Hill, who he's kind of criticizing, in the sense that Hill was very, you know, surface level, cellular, you know, within the muscle. I think Noakes almost goes too far to the other extreme, being, you know, it's all very neurocentric and this is kind of the end all be all. And, you know, if we kind of reference talks that we had, you know, viewing the human as a complex dynamical system, you know, this makeup, a system of systems, then we can kind of already start to think about, well, you know, it's probably not any one thing that is really truly guiding or governing this. So I think, you know, exercise regulation is some sort of balance between competing requirements of physiological protective mechanisms and psychological success or drives. And I think the easiest way to think about it is there's probably, yes, involvement, you know, neural at the level of the brain or supraspinally, but I also think the easiest way to think about it is more from like a negative feedback loop perspective where we are getting input, locally at the cellular level. There are mechanisms, within tissue to kind of prevent us from going too far in any one direction, which is essentially the very definition of a negative feedback loop. So I think, yes, the brain obviously plays a role in this. Is it the end all be all? Is it the only thing that is going to govern exercise performance? I would say no. And I think that we have good evidence, kind of to oppose that, to suggest that it's probably a confluence of peripheral level negative feedback loops with central level, maybe kind of input or regulation to a degree, but I don't think it would be wise to say that it's one or the other, kind of create this dichotomy where it's purely supraspinal driven versus purely in the periphery.
And I think that's a big gripe of Samuel Marcora and others is what you just talked about. This body brain model, this brain in a vat model. It's a very similar discussion with like pain. Where pain is just inputs, outputs, where a brain in a vat, or no, you can't separate us from the environment. We're embodied and embedded, and it all works in a dynamic system. Exactly what you just said. So like I said, all parties seem to agree that A.V. Hill's model, we need to move on from, or at least where it had kind of stayed. We don't like to, and I think that's another thing is like not bashing old researchers who started us even having the conversation. Like they're the reason that we're even talking about this stuff now, but it's just time to move on from that. And I think Noakes made that point clear, but then to your point, the pendulum swings to the other end, and then there's not really a whole lot of hard evidence to support. Like a central governor is a very discrete, concrete concept. Like when you say central governor, you think about something very specific. Like what part of the brain is it? Is it the entire brain? I think then it's becomes too nebulous. So when we haven't actually, nailed that down, it's what are we really talking about? One thing that I found interesting in here is the paper that they talked about using the task, effort, and awareness scale, where it was a paper in 2012 where they measured people's RPEs. They had them do a 100-kilometer bike ride, and they had them do 1 kilometer sprints kind of sprinkled in, and then one at the very end. And their RPE they used the traditional Borg scale, or the 19-point scale. And their RPE didn't cap until the very end, the end of the last sprint, basically the end of the 100 kilometers, which you would expect. Like that's the linear relationship between RPE and time doing work. And then they ended that period of time doing work with a maximal effort. So like RPE scaled. And it's very possible that the people knew that the end of the race was near. So it's like, oh, this is the end and I'm trying really hard. And then RPE tips. And that's what we would expect. But then they also measured the task, effort, and awareness, which basically the TEA scale, this is on page 7, was measuring their sense of effort, their ability to maintain their RPE. And it's measuring kind of a slightly different construct. And what was interesting is during the 1 kilometer sprints kind of sprinkled in, the ones that happened before the end, let's say they were at like kilometer 50 and now it's time to go hard for a kilometer. RPE didn't really spike during that sprint, but the TEA scale did. And each sprint, this TEA scale spiked to maximum. So it's almost as if the overall exertion is kind of anchored to just the entire task. And then you need another scale to measure little pockets of effort in between, which I thought was really interesting. And I actually pulled that paper and they didn't have the scale was in like one of the appendix, and I couldn't pull the appendix. So I couldn't actually find what the scale was, like what questions they were asking or what it looks like or whatever. But I'll dig a little bit. But I thought it was interesting because of like strength training, for example, where a lot of times, let's say you're doing like back squats at singles or doubles or triples or whatever, but it's like 60%, 75%, 80%. So it's not maximal load. and you're not going to repetition failure. You're maybe just trying to move really fast. So your reps in reserve or your RPE might be really low, but your exertion is maximal. So there's nothing to measure that construct. Or I thought maybe the TEA scale was almost synonymous with whatever scale we would use to measure effort on each individual repetition. So like, let's say if somebody does a triple at 70% of their 1 rep max, you know, their reps in reserve might be like 10, but their individual effort on every repetition was maximal because their intent was to move the barbell as fast as possible. So that was something that I was making some type of parallel there, but I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept too, because it's almost like the system becomes more aware of what's going on because it's experiencing like an unexpected change. You know what I mean? Whereas when you're anchored, like I know that this is the end point here, the RPE is going to stay relatively stable because I know that I'm this far ahead. It's almost as though like, because there's like a sudden change in the system, now all of a sudden, basic systems or protective mechanisms go into place because we're all of a sudden more aware of kind of what's happening because it was an unexpected change to the system. I think that's an interesting kind of maybe delineation between the two, but that's kind of where my mind goes, is all of a sudden now we're expected to overcome or perform at a level that we weren't planning on because we've had this interspersed, maximum sprint when we were told we were biking for 100 kilometers or whatever it may be.
They actually mentioned that. That's a really good point. On the same page, in page 7, the second column, they say exercise intensities that do not pose a threat to homeostatic control produce no or little sense of effort. So that would be like you're in the middle of your run and you've just found a nice groove.
Yeah.
And like, I don't run, but I can imagine that you can find a pace in which you could say, I could probably hold this for a while. And you get into that groove. And that doesn't involve, that would be like a low TEA scale score because the sense of effort is very low. You've kind of found that sweet spot. But to your point, they then say the conscious decision of whether to maintain, decrease, or increase the current workload, or indeed to terminate the exercise altogether, may be the outcome of a balance between motivation, the affect, the sensation that is defined as the sense of effort. So that's exactly what you just said. Like you're in your groove, you're in your slot. You could do this forever. You're not thinking, you're probably thinking about like what you're going to eat for breakfast tomorrow. But then you're like, oh crap, it's time to sprint. Now you have to come back to reality and make that decision of whether you want to do that. And then you probably start feeling things too.
Right, because it's almost like it's threatening because there's now sort of a discrepancy between, the strategy that you may have been utilizing at the start and the current task demands that you're being asked to perform at. So I think it makes sense to me that I'm now much more aware of kind of what's happening because, like we said, what does the brain do? It's a prediction machine, right? So anytime that there's any sort of disruption in what initial strategy or tactic that I may have employed from the start, it would make sense to me that now I'm much more aware kind of internally what's going on because I've had that sort of plan, so to speak, disrupted.
We have a raised hand. I think Diego.
Are you able to? You can't. I can't unmute it, or you can't, right? I have to do it.
I can just see it.
Oh, perfect. Okay, I'll unmute him. Lower hand. Okay, Diego, you should be good to go.
Yeah, hello.
What's up, buddy?
Awesome. Thanks guys so much. It's my first journal here, so I hope it's not like too off topic with this fatigue question. I was kind of curious, like, is there any mechanism by which we can like measure whether central fatigue or peripheral fatigue to form like the best strength training stimulus? Because I was looking a little further into it and I did find that like muscle damage also has like a really, really big influence on the level of fatigue we experience as well. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of curious, like, how do we go about forming the best strength training or hypertrophy stimulus without, because like peripheral fatigue can be kind of a good thing in a sense, like we want to burn out the lower threshold motor units to finally be able to recruit higher threshold motor units for growth. But then how do we know when to not take that too far so it doesn't accumulate too much central fatigue as well? I hope that makes sense. I know that was a lot.
Oh, totally. That makes sense. I don't have it's a great question. I don't think we have the answer. I, I don't think we've been able to parse out. So the central fatigue thing, and I admit that I am for sure not on top of all the evidence of fatigue. It's a huge topic, but central fatigue in regards to strength training, from what I've been seeing recently, there's not as much of it as we thought, just from strength training itself, and even like barbell powerlifter, we can for sure overflow the bucket, but it's hard. It's hard to go into an overtrained, like a true overtrained state. A lot of what we experience in strength training are very temporary. We feel like crap, like it accumulates on us, but it doesn't like send us into a hole that's so deep we need, 6-8 weeks to climb out of, in the sense of like truly overtraining. As far as, as far as a measure, I think the best that we've got from a practical standpoint are things like repetitions and reserve scales. Velocity-based training is a part of that too, just kind of auto-regulating the point at which you are at fatigue, or trying to quantify the distance you are from full muscular fatigue.
Yeah.
And hypertrophy is interesting because at certain loads, if the loads are light, you need to be at a sufficient effort level. So you actually have to go close to that red line, 3 reps in reserve or less to create an adaptation. But at the same time, I don't know how much central fatigue is really accumulating when we're talking about, like light load hypertrophy training versus fatigue that's peripheral and just more short term. But from a clinical standpoint, you mentioned muscle damage, and Samuel Marcour has done work on that, where muscle damage definitely increases the sense of effort. Like when you're sore and you try to perform the same bout of exercise, and we can all probably attest to that anecdotally as well. But soreness goes away, as long as you're training consistently, you take advantage of the repeated bout effect, and you're not going to have to worry about like extreme DOMs that's going to affect you. And if you are continuously worrying about or being subjected to extreme DOMs, you need to look at the way that you're programming.
Right.
That's a different conversation. But I think the short answer to your question is, I don't know if we have one measure, but I think practically trying to quantify the distance from failure that you are, and just, if you use the repetitions in reserve scale and you just say, we do all our work at 7 this block, and see how the organism responds to that, and then kind of adjust, on the fly. I know that's kind of a non-answer, but.
No, it definitely does answer my question for sure. Because like I was just so curious. I read so much about fatigue, and if I'm trying to like maximize my stimulus, I know like the goal is to try to avoid as much central fatigue as possible, right? But then it's also like, how do I understand? Because like if I were to perform a lot of like, let's say single joint exercises to go for more peripheral or like local muscle fiber fatigue, even that in itself like would cause more post-workout muscle damage. And I know you said you didn't get too much research on that, but it's really just like trying to figure out what would be the best measurement or like the best practices or any like key things that we should be looking out for. Because even with like the reps in reserve and RPE, like I love all that stuff, but I've just found personally that people really, really have a bad judgment or understanding of when they're like, oh, I'm actually at RPE 8, but they might have had like 4 or 5 more reps in the tank. Like I found some surveys that were like, if they were to give someone $1,000 for every extra rep they could have done after a set, it'd be a lot more reps. And like, so it's really, really hard for me to figure out like, do I trust RPE and RIR? I hope does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. I just don't think we have the measure that you want us to have, and that I want to have too. People get, I won't hit on the RPE thing too much, but people get better at RPE the more they use it. So it's like anything, it's a skill in and of itself. It's not perfect for sure. And depending on who people don't care about it or they don't understand it. So like, that's just an inherent limitation of RPE. That's 100% correct. But you can kind of triangulate your observations with their RPE scores and then your education on what RPE means. And then you throw in an AMRAP set every now and then so that they can anchor to what an actual 10 is. And over time, you might get somebody who's a little bit more accurate with that rating. It's just a process. With the velocity, one reason I like velocity-based training is because it kind of takes that out of the equation, or at least it's a more quantifiable objective measure than RPE. And it's measuring the same thing, essentially proximity to failure. We're just using velocity loss instead of RPE ascent. But some of the papers that I've seen on hypertrophy, if you lose, let's say you do a set of 8 and the 8th rep is 20% slower than the first rep or 40% slower than the first rep, 40% slower is going to be a lot more fatigue. You got 40% slower from rep 8 to rep 1, but it's only a little bit more hypertrophy and it's equal strength. So moral of the story is you don't have to be totally crushed at the end of a set of 8, for example, to get both strength and hypertrophy. Now, because not all of us have objective ways to quantify velocity of movement, we settle for RPE. But beyond that, I don't know. Kevin, you have any thought? Or Cody mentioned Mike T. So Mike Tuchscherer, Diego is a really, really awesome resource. He was actually on the Clinical Athlete podcast. Just Google. He's got a really, you're not gonna be able to spell his last name correctly ever. But just type in Mike T reactive training systems. And he is the originator of the RIR scale. He invented it in 2008. It took 8 years for us to actually start researching it, but he's the man. So anybody who's going to manage fatigue and strength training, Mike T is the guy. I would check him out.
We have another question.
Kevin, do you have anything to add on that?
I was just going to say that, I think it's important to kind of maybe create a little bit of a difference between like performance fatigue and kind of like perceptual fatigue, because I think it's rare that we actually ever kind of train ourselves into an actual like central fatigue. So I think as long as you're kind of watching like trajectory of numbers over time and whatever things you deem are important to you, that's probably a better gauge in terms of, how the person's responding to the stress that's being imposed. Are we really exceeding their adaptive capacity? Well, maybe if we're starting to see numbers across the board and everything that's important to us start to drop. But I think, from day to day, that's going to be much more kind of in the perceptual fatigue realm. And I think you have to take that with a grain of salt. So I would just be mindful of maybe the best indication of, are we maybe overdosing the stimulus is, what's their training look like over the course of, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. If we're continuing to see, very high RPE levels, maybe we're starting to see where perceptual fatigue and performance fatigue are maybe matching up more. But I think the trajectory and kind of the long-term numbers watching is maybe a better place to go to in terms of trying to decide, am I reaching a point of central fatigue? And I think that's probably rare, but maybe something to consider.
I've got one more point on that as well, and it's session RPE. So I use session RPE as a very loose metric to kind of keep my thumb on the pulse of how the athlete's subjective response is matching up with their objective output. And for example, so I've heard Samuel Marcora speak about this, and he says it in a very, using it this way very systematically. I don't know if it works out like that in the real world, but it's how I conceptualize it. So if you have a workout on Monday and it's the same workout this Monday and the same workout next Monday, and last Monday you did, or let's say this Monday, you did more weight and you rated the session at a lower session RPE. So you're able to move more weight at a lower session RPE, or you repeated all the same weights, but the session RPE was also lower. So you basically repeated the workout, but it felt easier. That's one way to gauge, okay, that's adaptation. That's a good thing. He or she's feeling pretty fresh right now. But let's say weights went up, but session RPE also went up. Is that actually an adaptation, or is that just you decided to push harder and now you've basically just, effort and load are now pushing in the more direction? You probably could have done that last week. So I'm just kind of like, okay, it's good that more weight was on the bar, but it was also a harder session. So that's kind of a wash. And now in this scenario, last week, weights go down now. So this week you weren't actually able to lift as much or as fast or run as far. And session RPE was higher. So not only was output less, subjective effort and perception of effort and difficulty was higher. So then that's at least something to have a conversation about now with the athletes. Say, hey, I noticed this, how you feeling? Because I don't get, don't freak out about any one-off workout. But if that's the trend that I'm seeing consistently now, performance output is either tailing off or kind of plateauing, and subjective rating of effort for the session is trending up, it might be time for a conversation or some type of modification of training load, something like that. So that's maybe one metric too that you can use.
Thank you guys so much. That was super helpful.
Of course. Chris, Taylor, I know we got Christopher's hand up. I don't know if he put his hand up before the other questions came in.
So I think there was another question just in the chat. Tommy said, what do you think of going to momentary muscular failure at a low volume instead of velocity?
Yeah, it's, so that's what the low load hypertrophy literature would tell you that you have to do. If you're using lighter loads, like, that's nebulous too, but 20, 40, 50% of 1 rep max, then you have to go to a closer proximity to failure anyway, if you even want the adaptation. From a strength perspective, you can still make really good strength gains. Like even in trained athletes can lift light loads and make strength gains, which really hits against my bias. I don't want it to be like that, but it's actually true. I don't think you have to go to as far or as close to muscular failure to get those adaptations, because you can just use intent. So you don't have to measure velocity, but your intent is to move as fast as you can with each repetition. When it comes to hypertrophy training, you don't have to do that really. You can just like maintain mechanical tension on the muscles until you're at a certain proximity to failure. So Tommy, I think the question depends on kind of which trait you're going after to some degree. But I think when I prescribe low load training for hypertrophy clinically, I'm usually prescribing a pretty high effort level to go along with that, or a close proximity to failure. So that's what I have to say about that. I'm going to unmute Chris. All right, Christopher, you're up, man.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
So as I was reading some of these papers, the thought of kind of the similarities between fatigue and pain, and maybe not the commonality or not the correlation, but how there are a lot of similarities between, pain and fatigue. They're both highly subjective. They're both may not inherently mean tissue damage. They're somewhat protective mechanisms, but they inherently, especially with fatigue, it's so far from actual failure that it's just a thought that I was having. And I was curious if either of y'all have considered that, whether or not you have any extra thoughts about it or anything to add, just where there are a lot of commonalities between pain and fatigue, and they're both kind of inherently trying to protect the system, but they may not be needed as much as we think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I kind of mentioned that similarity between the pain thing in the beginning when we were discussing the difference between kind of a brain in a vat central governor model versus an embedded body environment model. I think there's a lot of similarities. Noakes kind of in this paper kind of touches on that at the very end when he's talking about the differences between the first place and the last place, where they can basically test the same in the lab. Like they have the same VO2 and the same lactate threshold, and like all that stuff is held constant. So like, what's the difference? And potentially is the difference the person who can just ignore the signals to stop better? Or is there some innate trait to do that? And pain, we could say, what makes a coper? Why are some people with the same injury on the outside, broken leg, ACL, whatever it is, they don't respond to it the same, from a subjective standpoint? And it is something I like. Gosh, it's a big question, right? I don't have an answer for it. I do think fatigue is somewhat, I don't want to throw the idea that it's not protective out, because in that book that I referenced, in the Endure book, there are cases where people have pushed themselves to death with this notion of just kind of fighting off the feeling. So I don't know where that line is, though. Samuel Marcora has done some really interesting research on brain fatigue, where he basically puts people in front of a computer and has them do very mindless tasks for a long time and fatigues their brain, and then has them go and do physical activities. And more times than not, they do a lot crappier after they've done some type of activity that just melts their brain. So like, imagine a long day at work and you're just tired and grumpy, and then you try to work out versus if you're fresh and you've got no worries. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, and it's a really, really interesting question. And I don't have anything of substance to add to it because I'm not smart enough and I don't know enough. But maybe Kevin has something really profound to say about that.
No, definitely. I think the fact that they are very closely correlated basically puts me in a position where it's like shrug emoji. Yeah. So I have nothing to add. I did kind of want to circle back on this, though, just because if you think about the center governor model, and this has been some of the criticism to it, is that as you kind of get down towards the end of the paper, he's basically saying like there's like, you know, an innumerable amount of things that can all influence this. And I kind of wanted to get everybody's thoughts, because some of the criticism of the central governor model has been this idea that it's so sort of almost vague in its description that it can't be falsified. And to determine like the quality of a theory, you need to be able to kind of place it at risk of being disconfirmed. And then only when it kind of withstands, you know, any number of explorations into trying to sort of disconfirm it or disprove it, can we say that it's probably a good model to run with. Did you have any thoughts on that in terms of like how you can actually take a model like this where it seems so all encompassing and kind of take the good out of it and apply it more broadly? But I thought that was a really interesting point, and just in some of the critiques of the central governor model is the fact that it's almost too broad and encompassing of everything, that it's really not a theory. And that's kind of one of the problems, like as Marcora mentioned, it's still kind of is maintained as a theory, but even not really so, because you can't even really test it because of the way he's kind of structured it in its entirety.
So the second Marcora paper that I linked to you guys in the chat says that it talks about that exact thing, Kevin, that you're talking about, how it can't be falsified. And that's one of the problems. Now, Tim, well, so what you would have to do, I mean, central governor, so you would have to define that, you know, what part of the central governor is the driver. And I don't know if they're doing fMRI studies with this. You know, I see a lot of, it's almost, I like all of these people because they're helping us learn, but it's almost like what we're seeing with the acute to chronic workload ratio, where there's very few data-driven papers, and there's a whole host of clinical commentaries that are driving the narrative to support the construct. The construct makes a lot of sense, but when you get down to the actual data that supports it, it's not all that strong. And I see something very similar here with this central governor model.
It's almost like purposely vague to where like, well, how can we really assess it as it is, you know, as an idea, as a theory, if we're going to just kind of have all this branches coming off of it? You know, even if you look at like figure 2, there's so much that is now kind of going into this model that it's set up in a way where you can't even really critique it, because the rebuttal would be like, oh, well, we kind of account for that by, you know, such and such. I think that's interesting, because it is kind of simple. You see it in a lot of things, right? This idea where, well, we actually are accounting for it here. But I thought that was a really interesting kind of point, to where a lot of these theories or models, you know, you can't really assess them for their efficacy or their whatever you want to call it, just because of the way they're set up from the get-go.
Well, it's kind of back to what Diego was getting at, where it's like, what do we measure? And it's kind of what you're talking about. What do we need to support the central governor model? So like figure 2, I see feed back and I see feed forward. I see a picture of the brain and I see a picture of the leg. So what is the mechanism of the feedback? What's talking to what and how is it talking? That those laboratories, we're getting down to the science of this now. So we have this hypothesis, this central governor, we'll call it a hypothesis now. We have this hypothesis and it's plausible. So it's got a face it's face validity to it. So now let's study the nitty gritty, try to identify what a central governor is exactly, what's the feedback mechanism, and then, try to broaden it out a little bit. But I don't think that piece, it's like almost like we hopped over that step. And then it just became a full-fledged theory without a whole lot of hard data to support. Now I'm not doing it. So, I'm just over here with an armchair quarterback. But Sammy Marcora, for example, doing all this brain fatigue research, that's kind of the road that he's taken with it. Okay, well, let me identify the brain, the mechanisms in this way, but yeah, interesting conversation. Now I know David has mentioned HRV, heart rate variability, as another metric, maybe Diego, to your question, in trying to differentiate between physical and psychological or cognitive fatigue states. Heart rate variability, essentially the heartbeat is supposed to be variable. So heart rate variability is actually the more variable, the better. The more variability you have between beats, like the time between beats, the idea is the better that your body's kind of adapting to the second by second perturbations that are happening. The problem with HRV, as far as I understand it, is that it's a lagging indicator. So you might, let's say your HRV scores are starting to tank. Well, it could have been kind of like a cumulative thing from training past. And so it's almost so far retroactive that it doesn't necessarily inform your decisions going forward or in the here and now. And I could be off on that because I've gotten a little bit detached from that literature base, but potentially one other metric you could use.
I think, doesn't Omega Wave try and look at the same sort of thing, just looking at more from like a specific though?
Yeah, Omega Wave, Whoop, the Whoop app. There's a lot of them now. And I think as long as they're reliable, so the validity is a different conversation. Is it measuring what it's supposed to measure in the moment that it's supposed to measure it? And I'm going to take a guess that a lot of these things the answer is probably no. But if it's reliable in the sense that it's consistent and repeatable over time, you're off target, but you're off target by the same amount every time so that you can still track change. It's just that the actual variable itself is probably not accurate. Like if I have a jump app and it says that my vertical is 48 inches right from the beginning, it ain't 48 inches. But if it's at least the same amount of off every time I use that measure, and the app says my vertical went from 48 inches to 52 inches, I can be confident that I still gained 4 inches on my vertical. It just wasn't 48 to 52. It's probably like 12 to 16, something like that. So
yeah,
but I don't know about the reliability of these things either.
That's sort of my kind of question with it, with a lot of the wearable tech stuff. The idea that, an algorithm that is proprietary is somehow going to be able to give a better indication of to my state of readiness than my, my own being itself. That's where I kind of get lost in some of that.
Jordan brings up a really good point in the chat. He says he heard that HRV technology has questionable precision accuracy, which is kind of what we're talking about in these contexts. But there it becomes a question of becoming a nocebo if it reads bad. If you have a bad recovery day, in reality, you may perform fine or feel great. So I've got an athlete who just went on their own right now and just got Whoop. Like, I didn't even know he was going to do it. He's like, oh, I just got this thing. I'm like, all right, well, I told him to take a screenshot every day and start putting it in like the comments of our workouts, just so I can kind of see what's what. And one question I'm going to pose to him after a couple of weeks is like, so when this thing says you have a bad day, is that consistent with what you actually feel like? And I'm going to look at his objective data. But yeah, you don't want it to be a self-fulfilling prophecy to some degree, especially if you have a question about whether this thing is even accurate. Do you want to listen to it? It's saying chill out today, but you feel fine. Or it's saying go hard today, but you feel like shit. It's hard to know what to listen to, Taylor, we have any other questions? Oh, we got a hand raise.
Yeah, we have a hand raised, and I hope Lucas asked about HRV also in the Q&A. So Lucas, I hope that answered your question also. If not, send me another question.
Oh, I think so. I think it hit it. But yeah, hit us up again. I'm gonna unmute Marcia.
Hello. I just said Marcia instead of Marsha. I was counting on that happening.
Marcia, oh, were you saying, so you're good? Do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I do. So I was going to circle back to where you mentioned the kind of the chart, the feedback, and the lead and the brain, and okay, what's feeding what, who's going where, and how we skipped it. I mean, I would say if we figured out that pathway and that mechanism, then we would have solved like chronic fatigue syndrome by now, and we're all still pretty lost on that. So it doesn't really seem like we're getting anywhere in terms of figuring out, okay, is it this pathway? Okay, is it sodium potassium channels? Okay, or is it hormonal? And I don't think that's getting anywhere.
Yeah. So, and I want to make sure, because we're getting a little bit of an echo feedback thing on our end as far as your audio, but I think I got your question is, beyond this, we're talking about performance, we're talking about races and sprinting and endurance and lifting weights. What about things like chronic fatigue syndrome and, all of these diagnoses of exclusion, where like chronic fatigue syndrome is literally us saying like, we have no idea what's going on, but you seem to be tired all the time. And so we're going to, we're going to call this chronic fatigue syndrome. And it's like very real for the people who are experiencing this, but we have no clue. Is it even the same thing? Is it even down the same path as the stuff that we're talking about? Or is it completely?
Who knows?
Yeah. And like clearly with that stuff, the brain, there are clearly psychological factors when it comes to that stuff. So I'm with you 100% on the question. And I don't know. I would think that this type of research, like if we can figure out fatigue mechanisms in healthy, physical active populations, we start to maybe extrapolate that to what maybe started a cascade of something like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome or something like that. But it's a lot of times such a different population too. They're not active. They got comorbidities, just other disease states, that can affect their perceptions and these types of things. So we're very far. It makes it hard for us, as practitioners too, when we don't even understand the mechanisms trying to treat things like that and trying to educate, what's wrong with me? They'll ask because they've gotten these diagnoses that really don't have any answers to them. And now it's a label, that needs to be explained, and we don't have the explanation. It's tough. So I appreciate the comment. I don't have anything profound on that either. I feel, man, really dropping the ball on this. It's hard, yeah.
That's what I'm saying. If they had the connection and the answer in this paper, then we would have solved a whole bunch of other stuff too.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I would say keep digging into, so this paper is from 2012 and the central governor theory is a decade older than that. And then I've mentioned Semi Marcora, but there's, you go on Google Scholar or ResearchGate and start digging into their recent papers, and maybe that'll give us a leg up. I've got a fatigue folder of papers that I just find that they're all proposing hypotheses and they're all proposing models, but I'm not seeing the rabbit trail get followed as much. And I'm sure that these research parties and teams are like going down that path because they're proposing their model and they're probably right now in the lab studying it. It's a very slow process. And I think Samuel Marcora's research on brain fatigue, maybe like people with chronic stress and things like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, maybe there's a connection there when it comes to just stressing kind of the psychological capacity of the brain. But again, that's, I'm grasping at straws with that as well. So David maybe has a comment on this. Standard LNMRSSD. I has the dumb with that acronym. I'm going to Google it. But David says it tends to be a general catch-all where PNN50 has been promising and teasing out more psychologically or cognitive variables. David, can you spell out those acronyms for the people in the back? Or is it heart rate variability that? Sorry, now I'm like reading research while I'm on air. Yeah, just spell out those things and we can maybe have a conversation about it. Let's see. Are there any other questions, Taylor?
I'm not seeing any.
Okay. What are your thoughts on this?
It's a lot.
Yeah?
I'm interested to see how some other like theories may fit into some of this, like the fitness fatigue theory, and things like that. And like almost like taking the accumulation of things and how it kind of builds on top of each other. I mean, we kind of talked about that already, but just kind of seeing how it relates to all those other theories, maybe.
Yeah.
It's just interesting.
I think right now we have to be careful about trying to go too far down the rabbit hole.
Yes.
We're holding a handful of sand and it's running out on us, and pretty soon we're not going to have anything left but our hands, right? It's like you're peeling away the layers of the onion and you're left with nothing if you go too far. So they're great conversations to have, but we'll probably just kind of circle back to the simple tools that we have at this point, which is our kind of our archaic metrics that we use, like RPE and our eyeballs and communication and conversation and our intuition. And then learning the retroactive, like, oh, sorry, didn't mean to flare you up. Guess we did too much, but learning from those situations, and then at least at minimum saying, okay, well, let's not do any more than that next week, or maybe do a little bit less. Like, it's going to come back to common sense, but it's still good to keep a finger on the pulse on where this stuff is headed. Because I think I don't know if it'll happen in our lifetime, but it'll still give us a better way to structure what we do.
David said in HRV signal detection, the different logarithmic values. So that's kind of what those
got it
for.
Yeah, I'm not versed in that stuff at all.
And then Michael had a question. He said, based on the results we saw with the TEA when programming, how specific do you think one should get with self-perceived exertion, a goal for the total workout, set, or rep?
It's hard to say without context. If it's an experienced lifter, I'm pretty specific with my reps in reserve prescriptions. It's another conversation between, are you using RPE descriptively or prescriptively, in that if you've got a beginner and you're just telling them what weights to use, or you're just going off past week's performance, like, hey, last week you used 50 pounds and it felt pretty good. So if you feel good to get in again today, you can try to maybe add 5-10 pounds. If you don't, you can hit 50 again, or even 45. So then you can have them use RPE just so they can get practice, but it's more descriptive. You're not actually using it to create decision making. You're saying, hey, yeah, and here's an RPE scale. So when you do your thing, I want you to tell me if you had 1 or 2 or 3 reps left in the tank, and you're just kind of getting them used to the scale. They're describing their effort, but that you're probably going to use your eyeballs and kind of how they moved and how they say the weight felt more subjectively than even the RPE scale. And you're just going to use all of that information to drive your decision going forward. If you have an experienced athlete, yeah, I want you to go up to RPE 8. And then I want you to decrease 10% and do drop sets of 3 sets of 3, but I don't want that RPE to be any higher than a 7. And that's somebody who's got years under their belt and is very in tuned with their proximity to failure and their perception of effort. So it really comes down to who we're talking about. If you want to read more on reps in reserve specifically and the research behind that, Eric Helms. You just research Gate or Google Scholar. Eric Helms, Michael Zordos, and those two guys right there have done a ton of papers on it for like big reps or many rep sets and low reps, high weight, all the powerlifting movements, bodybuilding type movements across the board. So those would be two people who to pull all their papers and read about that if you're looking for specifics, or read their blogs and stuff like that. But Kevin, you have any thoughts on Michael's question? It's a good question. It's just hard without context.
No, I think that's a really good point, though. The kind of the delineation between, are we using it prescriptively or descriptively? I think that's often maybe missed in some cases because, RPE, I feel like in stream. But again, if you are dealing with someone who's not experienced and you're kind of utilizing an RPE scale to guide dosage or, volume prescriptions, especially if it's not anchored or something like that, may not be the best thing. So it may be more useful just as a descriptive measure. So I think that's a really good point. And I don't think that gets mentioned enough because I think, people see RPE and now there's been sort of a push to kind of utilize that. But you could be leaving chips on the table or really not even getting the stimulus that you're after if the person is not kind of experienced with that and you are kind of just utilizing it more as a prescriptive measure as opposed to descriptive. So context and the population that you're working with is important. I thought that was a salient point.
Cool. Well, thanks for the question, Michael. The old school basics, don't go away with this stuff. The more information you have on somebody, and information can just be literally you seeing them do the movement, them telling you how it feels compared to what you see, their RPE rating, and you kind of compare that to what you saw and to what they told you. So you're triangulating all this information to decide whether they got the appropriate stress level of that exercise or not. And, you can objectify things by anchoring can simply mean, okay, do that weight, for 10 reps and easy, medium, hard. Okay, we're going to find a weight until it's hard and you're going to do it for 10 reps. Find a variable that you kind of keep consistent, and then you can build other variables within that. And if it's not 10 reps, if it's just as many reps as possible, you say, okay, I want you to go until you literally can't perform the exercise anymore, but you're not allowed to do any extra movement. And so you watch them real closely, or you put their back against the wall or something like that. And so you have maybe a rep range in your head. I want to hit somewhere between 10 and 15. So I'm going to find a weight that takes you to muscular failure within a technique constraint until you hit 10 or 15 reps, something like that. Now, if they've never, ever done resistance training before, then maybe you don't do that because you don't want to make them overly sore. So you purposely undershoot. So it's all about who we're talking about. Well,
we have a couple questions in the Q&A box.
Oh, shoot. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry
so Jordan said, slightly different type of question, but if we were able to track fatigue properly for a strength athlete, is there a standard length of program where we could keep fatigue high without too much trouble?
Well, we'd have to first be able to track fatigue properly and then we could answer the second part. I keep the microcycle going until I'm consistently seeing a drop off in output and a uptick in kind of the RPEs, either that be from exercise specific or the session RPEs. And consistent trend an entire week, that's kind of dependent, because some people can have 2-3 bad days in a row, and that's just kind of who they are. And I know there's going to be an upswing. And some people, if they have 2 or 3 bad days in a row, I know they're about to fall off the cliff. And so we change things up, or we deload right from there. So I don't have that standard length of time because I'm just monitoring things very closely. And so because of that, I purposely don't want to standardize it because everybody's so different.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that for sure. And like you said, just keep rolling with what they're going with until you start to see consistent trends and dropping. Because I think that's another area where people go wrong too, is maybe switching the stimulus too soon. Especially, I think most people can ride a program, for quite a while before they really kind of reach that point where it's time to kind of pivot or transition away.
Yeah.
But I think the best way to kind of gauge that is, like you mentioned, are we seeing, performance fatigue measures where output is dropping? Are we seeing that kind of consistent with creeping RPEs or session RPEs? Then maybe it's time to pivot away.
Jordan kind of follows up with that and says, it sounds like an emerging strategies approach. Yeah, very much so on my end, am influenced by Mike Tushier. And I see Javier's question. He says, I'm curious on your guys' take regarding how fatigue is an emotion to protect body homeostasis, as well as the fact that only 30 to 60% of muscle mass is recruited, relates to acute injuries. Now, I think the 30 to 60% of muscle mass, again, in the Noakes paper that we were going over tonight, that's endurance-based sports. So if we're talking about full effort strength training, it's probably a greater percentage of motor units being recruited in that sense. And if you're going to muscular failure, you're at some point exhausting close to the entire pool. So now acute injuries, we almost have to parse that out, because are you talking about like a sprinter who pulls their hamstring on one specific stride? And in that case, we're not really talking about muscle recruitment or homeostasis. We're talking about mechanical stress, acute mechanical stress. Or are we talking about, let's say you incorporate a plyometric program and you just overdosed it, and on week 3 you started to get some anterior knee pain? It's still kind of a mechanical stress conversation almost, rather than you're too fatigued. Of course, as I'm saying that, maybe fatigue is just another term for overloading mechanical stress, and it's not like a perception of effort, but it's like a local mechanical fatigue. Like you're bending a paperclip, you're fatiguing the tissue.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll admit that I would kind of make the distinction between the fatigue and acute injury, because to me, I think it's more, especially something acute like that, if we're talking about strain or rupture, where it's probably more an indication where, the external moments were so much so that we weren't able to kind of overcome them efficiently or successfully internally. And it's kind of just load exceeded the capacity of the tissue there. But I don't even want to touch on what you just mentioned, because that just muddies the waters so much. So I like my little succinct thoughts about acute injury.
It's a great question, Javier. So I already knew this was going to happen with this topic, but like most of the questions are all just kind of shrugging our shoulders. They're fantastic questions. This is kind of where we are with this stuff. There was a monster paper that just came out that I want to share with you guys. It's open access. I'm not all the way through it yet, but it was a paper about RPE and essentially defining what we mean by effort. And hold on, let me pull that up real quick for you guys, because I want to drop it in. So the title of the paper is, What is Perceived Effort? Objective and Subjective Effort During Task Performance. And it's a monster. James Steele is the lead author. I'm going to drop the link in there. But I think as I'm getting through it, I need to get through it more, but I think it's going to help us at least start to model what the heck we're talking about. Because as I'm having this talk with you guys, I'm always thinking about, like, what do we mean by fatigue? Do we even sense, because in the Noakes paper, it's a sensation. But to Javier's question, does that also just mean like tissue? Is that another way to describe tissue failure? In the moment, over time, tendinopathy versus just a snap, crackle, and pop, like you fell off a ladder and broke your leg. Are those fatigue?
I actually have another paper to add to that I'll drop in the chat. This one it's much more on sort of like the physiology side of stuff, but it does address the central governor model directly. It's by St. Clair Gibson. It was 2017. And it's the interaction of psychological and physiological homeostatic drives and the role of general control principles and the regulation of physiological systems, exercise, and the fatigue process.
Oh my God.
So they propose the integrative governor theory. So I'll drop that in the, and they kind of have like 8 principles that kind of parcel out some of the flaws in the central governor model. But their biggest kind of point was that the reason why you don't have answers to any of this stuff is because exercise physiology has been kind of handcuffed by either being very much tissue specific fatigue related versus very much sort of, supraspinal, neuro locked in focused. So they kind of propose this balancing of physiological versus psychological homeostasis. And that's going to come down to the context and the individual. So I'll drop that in the chat too.
Cool. It keeps coming. It's such a similar conversation to pain is what we keep coming back to. That's interesting. You sent it only to me, Kevin.
Oh, I'll drop it in.
Also, copy and paste the title because people can they might not know they can just do the DOI, but I got the journal, the year, and the DOI.
All right, I'll drop it down here.
The title.
I'm getting it.
Copy and paste the title. Okay. We're all waiting.
There we go.
Look at that title. That's pretty cool, though. You read the whole paper?
No, I only found it last night, and it was so I was just kind of skimming through it, but it's really not that long. It's kind of more of this is the direction that we feel like the field needs to go to start to answer and address some of these questions.
Cool. Yeah, and that's open access too. So guys, if you just copy and paste that title, you'll see the ResearchGate link. I'll just do that. Oh, I made the same mistake. Okay. All right. Well, is that all we got, Taylor? Questions wise?
That's all I'm seeing.
Okay. Whew. I was worried about that one. I was afraid I was going to say something really stupid, like more stupid than usual.
Well, I'll tell you what, once chronic fatigue syndrome came up and fibromyalgia, I was just like, I'm just zipping it because I'll make an ass out of myself.
Yeah, it just shows how far we are. Seriously. Okay, so I know you guys are all probably suffering from brain fatigue at this time. This was a good meeting. I appreciated it. And Taylor and Kevin, it was always a pleasure. Thank you for your help. Really good paper. So was it Steven or was it Derek who suggested this one, Taylor?
It was Derek.
Cool. So Derek, I don't know if he's on the call, but we'll shout out. Oh, he is. Cool. Shout out to Derek for bringing the paper up and because I enjoyed reading it and it got us questioning and thinking about different stuff. So that's the goal of these things. So topics, guys, if you have any ideas for upcoming topics, throw them in the planning thread in the forum. We'll throw hamstring back in the hat because Kevin's still holding on to the grim hope that will make it. It's like 0 for 5 at this point, but
I think I first posed that 6 months ago. So at this point, it's just.
Yeah, we just got to find the hamstring, the topic that really sticks. It can't just be hamstring. It's got to be something real hook, riveting. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. I promise. We're going to make Kevin's day if hamstring becomes a topic at one of these meetings. Diego, glad you had a good time. Cody, thanks for coming, man. Hope it was helpful for all you guys. Okay, we'll see you next time.
See you guys.
Bye.